I just wanted to check my balance, old black maid said. Billionaire secretly followed her, and, in a voice as gentle as it was steady, the elderly black woman spoke, her words rising with quiet clarity through the suffocating elegance of the Charleston Capital Legacy branch's priority lounge in Charleston. I just want to check my balance, she said. William Prescott Jr. paused, his fingers suspended mid-air above the gold-plated keyboard of his computer. Slowly, he raised his head, peering over the rim of his expensive designer glasses, one brow lifting as if he had just heard the most absurd tale of the year. At the VIP counter, the woman stood upright, arms wrapped around an old leather purse. She might have been past 70, her skin darkened and weathered by sun and time, her eyes deep and uncommonly alert. Her dress was plain, her fabric shoes worn and faded, yet there was nothing about her that seemed out of place or timid. Around her, the faint click of leather soles on marble echoed softly, mingled with the scent of high-end perfume, the chill of central air, and the rich smell of leather furniture and money. Tailored suits shimmered past her, designer handbags shifting lightly in the arms of coiffed ladies. The lounge's quiet conversations fell silent, as if someone had pressed pause. Then, the laughter began. Not loud, not crude. Just small, polite chuckles laced with condescension, the kind of sound that slices neatly through the delicate layer of human dignity. "Did you hear that, Helen?" William murmured to his wife, who was sipping tea beside him, but his voice carried just far enough for the whole room to hear. She wants to check her balance. Must have wandered in from across the street. The laughter spread like ripples through still water. No one spoke, yet their eyes spoke volumes. Those looks had followed Eunice Mae Johnson her entire life. But she did not waver. Not now. Perhaps she had once in her 20s, but not anymore. Her frail shoulders stayed upright, her chin tilted gently upward, her gaze sweeping over each face like she was ticking names off a list long memorized. She did not shout. She did not bristle with anger. When she spoke again, her voice was calm, almost tender. "My granddaughter told me to come to this counter at this time. She said there might be some folks here who still remember that name." A moment of silence fell. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to falter. William Prescott squinted, the smirk he had worn just seconds earlier hanging awkwardly in the air as she went on. "Dorothy Mae Johnson," she said, clearly and deliberately, each word measured, and as that name settled into the space around them, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It was as if someone had switched off an invisible current and everything froze. The teller looked up sharply, fingers stilled mid-typing. Those who had been chuckling stopped abruptly, a few clearing their throats, to mask their discomfort. But Eunice did not move. She stood as if she had already lived this moment 1,000 times in her mind, until it no longer surprised her. From beneath the soft earth-colored scarf at her neck, her eyes gleamed with something hard to name. It was not pride. It was not anger. It was the silence of someone who carries a truth the room is not yet ready to bear. Before we continue with the next chapter of this unexpected and deeply moving story, if you felt your heart dip slightly or stir with something quietly real inside, take just a moment to support the Emotional Echoes channel by hitting that subscribe button, liking this video, and sharing it with a friend or loved one who might need to be touched by a story like this. Every single subscription is a gentle reminder that even the smallest stories can reach into the heart of a listener, no matter where they are. And we'd truly love to know, where are you listening from right now? Leave us a comment below and let us see just how far Mrs. Eunice's journey has traveled. Maybe it's a quiet corner of your kitchen, maybe it's on the bus in the rush of everyday life, or perhaps it's during a late night when you're searching for something to believe in. We're always listening, and we deeply value every heart that resonates with these stories. Now, let's return to the next part. No one moved. Eunice Mae Johnson remained standing exactly where she was, her weathered hands resting lightly on the faded leather of her old purse, her face betraying nothing but an unsettling calm. Behind the marble counter, the bank employee blinked repeatedly, as if trying to recall whether the name Dorothy Mae Johnson meant anything among the thick files buried in the data system they all assumed they had long since mastered. William Prescott Jr. stared at her, the smugness in his eyes shifting gradually into something less certain, part suspicion, part confusion. His wife, Helen, still held her teacup close to her lips, but she was no longer sipping. Her gaze had sharpened with quiet vigilance. Then, in a voice that seemed to lean into jest but strained to hold control, William spoke, attempting to pull the room back to safer ground. "Dorothy Mae Johnson? Who might that be? Maybe someone who used to clean here?" A few chuckles followed, but they no longer landed with conviction. No one was quite sure whether it was still appropriate to laugh. The atmosphere had begun to thin, stretch tight. The man behind the counter, dressed in a pale gray suit, turned slightly to whisper something to the assistant manager nearby. Then he looked back at Mrs. Eunice, offering a polite, hesitant smile. "Ma'am, this is a priority area reserved for our high-tier clients. If you require standard assistance, the regular service branch is right across the street at the corner of King and Market." But Eunice did not step back. Instead, she opened her aged purse and drew out a thick envelope, yellowed at the edges with time. In neat, slanted script across the front, it read, "To the Regional Director of Charleston Capital Legacy, to be opened only in the presence of Mrs. Eunice Mae Johnson." Her hand placed the envelope onto the polished white marble counter, the motion gentle but unmistakably firm. There was nothing about her that suggested a person who was lost, nothing that hinted at someone asking for help. On the contrary, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone following instructions handed down long ago. "I'm not mistaken," she said, her eyes locking onto the uneasy gaze of the man across the counter. "I've come to the right place, at the right time, just as my granddaughter instructed. She said everything needed to happen here." William stepped in closer, as if drawn forward by a situation that no longer seemed amusing. "And who is your granddaughter? Does she work for someone here?" His voice still carried a trace of disdain, but his chest had begun to tighten, sensing something slipping beyond his control. Eunice tilted her head slightly, looking at him as only someone who has known men like him all her life could. "My granddaughter's name is Althea Johnson. Perhaps you don't know her, but perhaps you know what my grandmother built." At that moment, a woman in a dark blue suit appeared at the far end of the hallway. Her stride was swift, confident, the gait of someone long accustomed to making decisions. The staff straightened instinctively as she approached. It was Clara Simmons, the regional director of the branch. Clara stopped directly in front of the counter, eyes falling on the envelope before slowly lifting to meet Eunice's face. For a moment, her eyes widened, then softened, as if a long-buried memory had suddenly stirred to the surface. You're Eunice?" she asked, her voice low, almost trembling. Eunice nodded gently. "It's been a long time, Clara. I've come because of an old promise and the will of someone who has passed." That sentence dropped into the room like a stone into deep water, sending out slow, rippling waves of silence. No one laughed now. No one asked another question. There was only the sensation that something long familiar within these marble walls had just begun to shift. Slowly, but irreversibly. Eunice still stood there, like an old marker stone in a city shedding its skin. Her calm wasn't indifference. It was the unshakable certainty of someone who had been pushed to the margins all her life, but had never once allowed the world to decide her worth. Clara Simmons stood in silence, eyes fixed on the woman before her. The name Eunice Mae Johnson had lived somewhere in the recesses of her memory for decades, a faint outline from her childhood in the poor northern quarter of Charleston. Back then, as a little black girl raised by a single mother, she had learned her letters from this very woman's Saturday afternoons in a small kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and warm cornbread. As Clara rose through the polished corridors of banking and corporate ambition, she had buried that memory beneath the layers of time and advancement where names like Eunice's were seldom spoken, especially when they belonged to housekeepers or elderly black women without degrees. But today, that name had not only returned, it had arrived bearing a sealed will and a silence so thick it pressed down on the marble-paneled luxury of the bank's high-end lobby. Clara stepped forward, her heels tapping softly against the stone floor, the only sound remaining in the suddenly suspended air. She reached out and took the envelope from Eunice's hands, her eyes scanning the handwritten address, then lifting again to meet the lean, proud face standing across from her. Without a word, Clara motioned to the staff to unlock the office door behind her. Just before she entered, she turned to the teller, still frozen behind the counter. "Shut down access. Suspend all transactions at this desk for the next 10 minutes. The man nodded quickly, but his eyes stayed fixed on the back of Eunice's coat, as if he feared blinking might cause him to miss something vital. William Prescott Jr. stood nearby, his expression caught somewhere between suspicion and confusion. He was too accustomed to being the man in control, the one who dictated the pace and tone of any room he entered. But now he could feel something slipping just out of reach, a quiet but unshakable force, rearranging the order he had believed was permanent. As the office door closed behind Clara and Eunice, whispers began to stir through the lobby like wind through tall grass. Helen leaned in toward her husband, her voice low. "What do you think this is about? That name, Dorothy Mae Johnson, it sounds familiar somehow." William didn't answer right away. He turned instead to the teller, who was still standing rigidly at attention. "Hey, you," he said, his voice no longer carrying the same ease. "Is there a Dorothy Mae Johnson in the system?" The teller glanced around as if waiting for permission, then turned to his computer, typing quickly. His face shifted almost instantly, first a furrow of confusion, then widened eyes, and finally lips moving in a whisper with no sound. William stepped closer, trying to peer at the screen, but the teller quickly tilted the monitor down and closed the window. "I'm sorry, sir. That information has been escalated to the regional director. I no longer have access." "No access?" William raised an eyebrow. "I'm a diamond-tier client here. You know who I am, don't you?" "Yes, Mr. Prescott, I do," the teller replied with a dry swallow. "But this is a direct order from Director Simmons. There's nothing more I can do." William took a step back, the first thin cracks of unease beginning to slip through the armor of his pride. He muttered under his breath. Johnson. It can't be Johnson Holdings?" Helen turned sharply, her face paling. "You mean that Johnson, the real estate investment firm, the one we signed that partnership agreement with just a few months ago?" William didn't respond, but his silence was telling. He was already rifling through his memory, trying to piece together connections that had gone unnoticed. And then, something flickered behind his eyes. He straightened, eyes wide, as a possibility struck him one he had never anticipated. If Eunice was the heir to Dorothy, and if Dorothy was linked to that investment firm, then this situation was far more precarious than he had imagined. Behind the office door, Clara sat reading the letter, her eyes moving slowly down each line. When she reached the signature, she let out a soft breath, her hand resting gently on the envelope as if trying to absorb the last warmth of a life now gone. She looked up at Eunice once more. "So it's time," she said quietly, almost reverently. Eunice nodded. Dorothy had been preparing for this day for a very long time. She always said, "The ones who used to laugh will have to listen if you speak at the right moment." No one in that marble and glass room could have imagined that a single name might be enough to freeze the air, to shift the ground under them in less than 10 minutes. But that was the truth. Because in this world, there are names built not from recognition, but from wisdom, endurance, and a plan no one ever saw coming. And Dorothy Mae Johnson was one of those names. Clara Simmons placed the letter gently back onto the walnut desk, her hand still trembling slightly. The soft glow from the desk lamp illuminated the elegant handwritten script, each line of blue ink still sharp and deliberate, as though it had been penned just yesterday. In the quiet of the office, Clara sat across from Eunice Mae Johnson, and between them lay more than half a century of memory. They had once known each other when Clara was just a little girl, her hair braided into 2 neat plaits, sneaking around the back of the grand Prescott estate to the kitchen, where she could beg a cookie from the warm-smiled housemaid everyone called Miss May. Back then, Eunice spoke in tones as soft as lullabies, but her eyes were always wide open and watchful. And now, that same woman sat before her in a faded brown dress, her thin hands folded on her lap, back still straight as ever. Clara sat in stillness, her mind spinning with every word she had just read. Dorothy Mae Johnson, a woman she had heard spoken of only in vague whispers, a shadow on the edges of real estate negotiations, had revealed herself to be part of a story Clara had lived without ever knowing. The letter addressed to Clara read like a final testament. In it, Dorothy traced her quiet journey, from a Gullah-born girl once denied an education to a self-taught reader and writer who slowly, deliberately, stepped into the world of real estate, a world that had assumed she was good for nothing but cleaning and cooking. She began with a single rundown home on the southern edge of the city, fixed it, rented it, saved every penny. Over 3 decades, she had quietly built a powerful network of properties, all hidden behind modest corporate names, shielded from the prejudice that might have destroyed them. No one knew that while working as a housemaid in the Prescott household, Dorothy had been buying up the very properties that William Prescott Sr. had sold off in desperation during the financial crash. She told no one. There were no boasts. Every transaction recorded in a worn notebook, locked away in an old wooden drawer. In her letter, Dorothy confessed that she knew her time was nearing its end, and she believed that when the moment came, the only person with both the courage and integrity to carry out her final wishes would be Clara Simmons. Not everyone with a title held onto their character, she wrote, but Clara was different. Eunice sat quietly still, her gaze never leaving Clara, as though she was reading every flicker of thought across the woman's face, searching for signs that the letter had reached its true recipient. Clara finally looked up, her voice tight in her throat. Why me? Why did she trust me with this? Eunice smiled a small, unadorned smile, not triumphant, but certain. Because she once saw you stand up for a Haitian boy who was denied an account here. When no one else spoke, you did. She said, there are people whose honesty needs no sermon. You see it when you watch closely. Clara bowed her head. That memory, faint, almost forgotten, rose again like a tide. The admiration she now felt for Dorothy, the trust placed in her by Eunice, and the weight of what had just been placed in her hands pressed the air into stillness. She opened a drawer and retrieved a small key. I'll need to access our archived records. If what's in this letter is accurate, then you may be holding a significant share in the Prescott financial infrastructure, something no one saw coming. Eunice nodded gently. I know, but I haven't come to claim anything. I've come to fulfill a promise. She always said, truth has its moment, and when it comes, it's not to avenge. It's to restore the balance. Clara rose and walked toward the records cabinet. Her hand shook as she slid the key into the lock. When the door swung open, rows of documents emerged, portfolios from various shell companies, many of which had been quietly folded into investments managed by this very bank, their true ownership obscured. One by one, the pieces began to connect. As Clara skimmed the names, the holdings, the leases, the transfers, she realized that something vast was beginning to take shape, and at the center of it all, at the very heart of the quiet storm now rising, was the woman seated before her. Clara Simmons remained still before the open safe, her eyes locked on the stack of documents that, until moments ago, she had known only as anonymous investment firms, vague financial entities that rarely attracted attention. But now, each line of type, each seal and ownership record was redrawing the map of power within this bank in a way no one had seen coming. At least 4 of those companies held stakes in major Prescott Group real estate projects. What Clara could barely grasp was that every one of them traced back to a single name long forgotten by the financial world: Dorothy Mae Johnson. And now, the sole legal successor was the woman seated quietly across from her, Eunice Mae Johnson, still as composed as ever, like an old oil lamp whose flame had never gone out. Clara slowly laid the files down on her desk, her heart pounding faster. This was no longer a matter of inheritance or final wishes. This was a seismic shift in power, quiet, deliberate, and if handled carelessly, it could send tremors through not just the bank, but the entire investment network across the South. Eunice said nothing more. She understood that now was not the time for words. She let Clara trace the lines on her own, let the weight of truth settle naturally where it belonged. Sometimes silence is the only way to let truth take root. Meanwhile, outside in the lobby, William Prescott Jr. paced anxiously, his movements beginning to betray a nervousness he was trying hard to contain. Each minute that passed behind that closed office door felt like another thread unraveling from the tight weave of control he believed he held. Helen joined him, gently placing a hand on the sleeve of his tailored jacket. "William, are you absolutely sure you don't know who that woman is?" He shook his head. "I don't know for certain, but I have a bad feeling. The name Johnson, it's familiar in a way I can't explain, and what worries me is that Clara clearly recognized her." Helen said nothing. Her eyes shifted, uneasy. She had rarely seen her husband so unsettled, especially in a space where he usually moved like he owned the air itself. At that moment, the office door opened. Clara stepped out. Her face no longer carried the strain of uncertainty. Instead, it held the cold clarity of someone carrying a truth larger than herself. She turned to the front desk. "Call Legal Affairs and the Executive Contracts Division. Have them meet me in Conference Room 3 immediately, and pull all documentation on property investment shares from 1997 to present day." At those words, William stepped forward, trying to keep his voice even. "Clara, what's going on? What are you doing?" Clara paused and turned, her gaze landing on him with a weight that made William instinctively shift back half a step. "You'll want to be in that room." William realized that if Johnson Holdings was a major investor in the bank's fund, they could freeze his credit lines instantly. She said evenly, "If I were you, I wouldn't stay on the sidelines today. Because what's unfolding right now might just change the way you see the entire system you think you're running." William frowned. "Change? Because of what? Some old woman no one knows?" Before Clara could respond, Eunice appeared in the doorway, walking slowly, though with no sign of weakness. Her eyes passed briefly over William, then rested on Helen. There was no anger in her gaze, no trace of superiority, only the quiet certainty of someone who had every right to be present and always had. Clara glanced at her and tipped her head slightly. "Are you ready?" Eunice nodded. "I've been ready for a very long time. It's the world that needed time to catch up with the things it once chose to overlook." And together, they walked down the corridor toward the far end of the building, where the conference room doors waited. This time, Eunice did not walk behind anyone. She walked beside the most powerful woman in the bank, and with every step, her presence echoed like a quiet bell ringing the arrival of a force that no one in that building had ever expected to face. Conference Room 3 at the Charleston Capital Legacy branch was never meant for stories that stirred the heart. It had been built for million-dollar transactions, discreet meetings between executive boards and elite clients, a space where every detail was curated, from the lighting to the climate, to maintain control. But on that morning, the air in the room felt uncertain, unsettled, as if no one fully understood what was happening, only that something far greater than any one person was drawing near. Eunice Mae Johnson entered the room without waiting for direction. She walked to the center seat along the long boardroom table and sat calmly, directly across from the projection screen. Clara Simmons took the chair beside her, flipping through the carefully compiled files. William Prescott Jr. stood at the far end, arms crossed, his composure beginning to fray at the edges. Less than 10 minutes later, 2 legal advisors and an investment assessment specialist arrived and took their seats. Clara handed the first stack of documents to legal. The room grew heavier as the man reached the third company name. Each one traced back through an intricate web of anonymous shares, long believed to belong to a group of venture capitalists, but now undeniably revealed as components of a single structure built by Dorothy Mae Johnson. Each company held pieces of valuable land throughout Charleston, Savannah, Atlanta, and New Orleans. One of them was even the silent investor behind the very office complex where the Prescott Group had its headquarters. All had been operated under private financial trusts, cloaked in privacy laws so airtight that not even the bank had been able to uncover the true owner until now. Clara paused and pointed to a highlighted page. "This is the inheritance allocation after Dorothy's passing. The sole legal beneficiary is Mrs. Eunice Mae Johnson. No intermediaries." The room fell into a deep silence. William remained still, but his hands had closed into fists. Across from him, Helen tilted her head and whispered something, but he did not respond. No one spoke for several moments because everyone knew the truth would be confirmed as soon as they checked the records. Eunice did not look at anyone. She simply placed her hands on the table, thin but steady, and when she spoke, her voice came slowly, not loud but clear, enough to quiet every private thought in the room. Dorothy never intended to leave this to the financial world. She built it to protect those who came after, to have a voice when women like her were expected to be invisible. She once told me, "Real power isn't about applause. It's about knowing when to stay silent and when to arrive." Clara nodded, eyes still on the documents. She wrote that plainly. She didn't want to reveal what she owned while she was alive because she didn't trust the world to accept that a black woman with no formal education could have built a real estate network larger than a family-run conglomerate. The legal advisor cleared his throat, his voice steadying with effort. "Mrs. Johnson, do you know how much of the Prescott-linked investment network you currently hold?" Eunice turned slightly to Clara, who answered gently in her place. "Approximately 21%, based on current valuations and undistributed trust assets." William let out a short, bitter laugh. 21%? That's veto power in certain board meetings. Clara looked up and met his eyes. "Exactly. And under the corporate charter, one you signed 10 years ago, any shareholder with 20% or more may request an internal audit and call an emergency board session if there's reason to believe there's bias or mismanagement within leadership." The silence returned, heavier this time. All eyes slowly turned to Eunice, and this time there was no contempt, not yet reverence either, but something new and emerging caution, a dawning awareness. She met their gaze without needing to assert herself. She didn't have to project power. She was power, not because of the documents spread across the polished table, but because this entire room, this entire institution, had operated for years beneath the shelter of something she and Dorothy had quietly built, back when they were regarded as nothing more than the help. And now, that shelter had grown into something no one could ignore any longer. The tree they had planted in silence, in service, had stretched its roots deep and wide, and this morning, it finally cast a shadow large enough for all to see. Conference Room 3 at the Charleston Capital Legacy branch was never designed to hold stories that stirred the heart. It was built for million-dollar negotiations, for closed-door meetings between executive boards and high-tier clients, a space where everything was controlled: light, temperature, tone. But that morning, the atmosphere inside carried an unfamiliar weight, the kind of quiet that signals not confusion, but a collective sense that something far bigger than anyone could name was drawing close. Eunice Mae Johnson entered the room without waiting for guidance. She walked to the center seat along the long table and sat down across from the projection screen with quiet purpose. Clara Simmons took the chair beside her, slowly flipping through the thick stack of documents. William Prescott Jr. stood at the far end, arms folded tightly across his chest, doing what he could to contain a rising tide of unease. Within 10 minutes, 2 legal officers and a representative from the investment valuation team arrived. Clara handed the first set of documents to the lead attorney. The air seemed to thicken as he scanned past the third company name. One by one, each corporation led back through a network of anonymous holdings, entities once believed to belong to a collection of private venture investors, now undeniably linked to a system of legal entities quietly established by Dorothy Mae Johnson. Each company held partial ownership in prime real estate across Charleston, Savannah, Atlanta, and New Orleans. One of them, in fact, was the hidden financial engine behind the very office complex where the Prescott Group now operated. All of them had been managed through layered trusts and protected by confidentiality laws that shielded ownership, even from the bank itself, unless someone knew exactly where to look. Clara stopped and tapped a section of notes. This is the share allocation outlined after Dorothy's passing. The sole legal heir is Mrs. Eunice Mae Johnson. No intermediaries, no contest. The room fell into complete stillness. William remained rigid, but his hands had slowly curled into fists. Helen, seated across the table, leaned in and murmured something, but he did not answer. No one did. Because everyone in the room knew the moment those records were formally reviewed, every system would confirm what now lay plainly before them. Eunice kept her eyes lowered. She made no attempt to meet their gazes. She simply placed her hands on the table, thin hands, weathered by time, yet steady, and spoke. Her voice was quiet but firm, not loud enough to command, yet strong enough to still every private thought in the room. Dorothy never meant for this legacy to belong to the world of finance. She built it to protect those who would come after her, to give voice to people like her who were too often made invisible. She told me once, real power isn't about applause. It's knowing when to stay silent and when to step forward. Clara nodded, her eyes never leaving the pages. She was clear in her letter. She kept her ownership hidden while she lived, because she never believed this world could accept that a black woman with no formal education could build something larger than a legacy family firm. The attorney cleared his throat, voice taut with restraint. Mrs. Johnson, do you know how much you currently control in terms of total investment shares connected to Prescott Holdings? Eunice turned to Clara, who answered in a voice that was calm but resolute. Approximately 21% based on current asset values and remaining undistributed trust holdings. William let out a short, bitter laugh, unable to disguise the sting behind it. 21%, that's veto power on certain board decisions. Clara looked directly at him. Exactly. And according to the board governance charter, you signed it yourself 10 years ago, any stakeholder with 20% or more has the authority to call for an internal audit and request an emergency session to reevaluate leadership if there's evidence of bias or mismanagement. The air in the room shifted again, pulled tight, and for a long moment, no one spoke. But the way they looked at Eunice had changed. There was no longer condescension, not yet reverence perhaps, but certainly caution, recognition, something new. Eunice didn't return their gazes. She didn't need to. Her presence didn't demand power. It was power. Not because of the documents in front of her, but because the entire room, indeed, the very structure that had stood for years, had been operating in the shade of a tree she and Dorothy had planted long ago, when they were seen only as help. When they moved through hallways no one remembered, built trust no one acknowledged, and wrote plans no one imagined they were capable of writing. And now the tree had grown too wide, too deeply rooted, too full of fruit to ignore. William Prescott Jr. was still standing there, but the self-assured presence that had long defined him was now little more than a paper-thin shell. The color had drained from his face, and the sharp, commanding glint in his eyes had dulled into something unmoored, shaken. From the moment he entered that room, he had believed this was some strange misunderstanding, a theatrical disruption that could be quelled with a few sharp words and the weight of his reputation. But the files, the legal confirmations, and above all, the unshakable calm of Eunice Mae Johnson were undoing him piece by piece. Not even an hour ago he had laughed at her, mocked her as though she were a confused old woman who had wandered into the wrong world. He had addressed her with that particular tone, the one that mixes pity with disdain, the way someone brushes dust from a velvet coat. He had spoken as if she were a smudge on the glass of a space meant only for the powerful. But now she sat across from him and made him see, without raising her voice or lifting her hand, that everything he believed he controlled could be undone in a moment. His mind returned, unbidden, to that name, Johnson Holdings. He had seen it before. In board meeting minutes, on long-term lease agreements, tucked into community development grants he had approved without reading too closely, assuming them to be routine, even obligatory gestures. He had never questioned whether Johnson Holdings was real, or if it was, assumed it was just another shell in a maze of corporate masks. But now, it was real. Not just real, but sitting right in front of him in the form of a woman the world had been trained not to see. Helen, sitting quietly nearby, turned to him and spoke, her voice unsteady. William, if all of this is true, then we've made a very big mistake. He turned to look at her, and for one brief second, the instinct surged inside him to rage, to deny, to sweep the papers off the table and declare it all a smear campaign. But he couldn't, because the truth wasn't just written in legal documents or ownership ledgers. It was written in how he had behaved since the moment Eunice walked in. Every slight, every dismissive glance, every word soaked in entitlement, and every senior staff member in that room had seen it. If any part of this ever leaked, he wouldn't just be seen as arrogant. He would be seen as a man who publicly belittled a strategic shareholder, a woman of color who had helped build the very institution he claimed to lead through trust investments he never even knew existed. Each line he had spoken now echoed in his head, stark and merciless. And Clara Simmons, though still professional, no longer looked at him with the quiet allegiance she once had. There was clarity in her eyes now, a recognition that the boundaries had shifted. She was a woman of principles, and she understood the difference between protecting a bank's interest and enabling misconduct. One of the lawyers cleared his throat and addressed the room. "We'll need to begin immediate verification of all transaction records and ownership documents from the last 3 fiscal years. If Mrs. Johnson's status as a shareholder is accurate, any delay or denial of access could be considered a violation of shareholder rights under state and federal law." Clara nodded without hesitation, her eyes still fixed on William. "There will be no delays. I'll authorize full access. As for you, Mr. Prescott, I advise you to consult legal counsel before offering further comment." William froze. In over a decade of working alongside Clara, he had never once heard her speak to him like that in clipped formal tones that left no room for assumed authority. No votes had been cast, no announcement made, but the balance of power had shifted. It had shifted the moment Eunice entered the room. Still, Eunice sat quietly, her slender hands folded neatly on the table, her face neither smug nor weary. There was no vengeance in her expression, just a kind of quiet clarity, the gaze of someone who had seen this moment play out in her mind again and again. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she believed that one day the truth would ask to be heard. And today it had. The woman they once treated as a disruption had become the mirror they couldn't turn away from. The joke they thought they were telling now echoed back as a nightmare no one in the room would soon forget. Because power, real power, doesn't arrive loudly. It waits. And when the world is finally quiet enough to hear it, it speaks with the full weight of everything it was once told it could never be. The air in Conference Room 3 had thickened to the point of stillness. No one spoke. No one moved. It felt as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something worse to surface. But for Eunice Mae Johnson, this moment was not a crisis. It was not a surprise. It was the summit of a plan forged quietly and patiently over nearly half a century, a vision shaped in silence, in kitchens and back stairways, in overlooked corners of rooms like this one. She did not need to shout to assert her place. The files on the table and the silence of those who had once dismissed her were proof enough of a truth long buried beneath the weight of assumption. Clara Simmons drew in a slow breath and opened a new folder. This one, a detailed report on cash flow and portfolio performance for Johnson Holdings over the past 20 years. The numbers were no longer abstract. They told the story of Dorothy's impact not just in terms of wealth, but of strategic influence across capital markets, affordable housing initiatives, and grassroots education programs. Some investments had rescued entire projects from collapse. Others had generated tens of millions in returns. All operated under the names of corporations no one thought to question. No one imagined they could be tied to a woman once known for cooking meals and mopping floors. "This," Clara said softly, "this is what she wanted hidden until after her death. Because she knew that if the world found out who was behind those deals, no one would leave her in peace." One of the lawyers nodded. "That's correct. Based on the structure we're seeing, Mrs. Dorothy Johnson wasn't just a founder. She was the principal backer of nearly 1/3 of all community development contracts throughout the southeastern region over the last 2 decades. Everything was clean. Everything was quiet. But there's something else." He paused, flipping through several pages before glancing up at Eunice. "Among the documentation, there's a clause, a reserved provision. A document marked for public release in the event that the heir is denied lawful access or subjected to personal humiliation at any location affiliated with Johnson Holdings." Clara looked sharply toward Eunice, her brow furrowed. "You're saying there's a trigger file, an emergency protocol?" The attorney nodded. "Yes, it's a notarized authorization signed by Dorothy Mae Johnson, granting her heir full access to internal records including audio, images, and supporting evidence for the purpose of protecting their legal and reputational interests." Without a word, Eunice reached into her bag and pulled out a small silver device. She placed it on the table and pressed a button. The room filled with sound, clear, unmistakable. It was the recording from earlier that morning. Every mocking remark, every condescending chuckle, every word William Prescott Jr. and several staff members had spoken to her in the lobby now played back in crystalline detail. It wasn't just audio. It was testimony, a living indictment no one could deny or explain away. Helen went pale. William froze, every muscle in his body stiffening. Sweat began to form along his brow, even though the room was chilled. Clara's face, once a mask of control, now reflected something harder, disapproval sharpened by disappointment. She tilted her head slightly and spoke, her voice low and clear. "So you anticipated being treated as someone without standing?" Eunice nodded. "Dorothy taught me that if you want to change how people see you, you don't always need to raise your voice. Sometimes you only need to let them hear themselves." The second attorney leaned forward, his tone now edged with warning. With a recording this explicit, any attempt to delay cooperation or deny information, whether by the institution or its representatives, could be classified as willful discrimination. If this reaches the public, the media consequences would be severe. William clenched his jaw, his gaze scanning the room. But the faces around the table no longer looked at him with respect or even allegiance. He was no longer seen as a leader, nor a pillar of legacy and wealth. He had become a liability, a reputational threat to everything the institution had tried to build, and it hadn't come with shouting or scandal. It had arrived like a steady tide on paper, in quiet voices, and now in the undeniable truth of a recording. The curtain had been pulled back not by force, but by precision, and no one could look away from the truth now sitting quietly before them. A truth in a faded dress, wearing reading glasses, bearing on her shoulders the legacy of a woman the world once deemed invisible. And suddenly, no one in the room could say they hadn't seen her. The moment the recording fell silent, the room descended into a stillness so dense it felt like a held breath, except this wasn't the silence of reverence. It was the silence of fear. William Prescott Jr. sat motionless, his eyes fixed somewhere on the table without really seeing it. His jaw was clenched tight, the muscles in his face rigid, and his fingers drummed a restless, uneven beat against the arm of his chair. Then, without warning, he stood abruptly, the movement sharp, almost desperate. He walked out of the room with quick, clipped steps, phone already pressed to his ear. The door shut behind him with a cold, final click, leaving behind a vacuum of presence that no one rushed to fill. In the long marble corridor outside, his stride was urgent, erratic, as though his feet no longer touched the ground. His mind was racing, flooded with outcomes, most of them catastrophic. He punched in a number his private legal counsel. His voice was hushed, but every syllable was taut with alarm. "I need you to review all partnership contracts with Johnson Holdings and any subsidiaries. Check if there's a termination clause, anything they can use to back out or sue. And go over the ethics compliance terms." The man on the other end was already typing. Within seconds he spoke, his tone shaken. "William, if what I'm seeing here is accurate, they can terminate the agreements immediately. No notice required." William froze mid-step, his hand gripping the brass railing at the edge of the hallway. "What do you mean, no notice?" "I mean," came the reply, "the contract includes a clause regarding discriminatory conduct and corporate ethics. If there's proof of such behavior within the partnership environment, Johnson Holdings has the legal right to activate an early termination on grounds of breach of moral standards, and that includes retaining all outstanding payments." A wave of heat surged through William's chest. That money wasn't just a number on a ledger, it was liquidity. It was lifeline. It was the funding chain for nearly a third of the active projects in his portfolio. He ended the call without another word, already dialing again, this time to his financial assistant. "I need a full update on our current credit agreements. If Johnson Holdings pulls out, how much time do we have before lenders demand early repayment?" There was a pause. Then, a voice, small and hesitant. 45 days, sir. But if Johnson issues formal notice, that window could shorten to 30. 30 days. 30 days to salvage a financial empire he'd spent almost 2 decades building. And now, it all teetered on the decision of a woman he hadn't even looked in the eye that morning. When he returned to the conference room, Clara Simmons was seated again, speaking quietly with the bank's legal counsel. The others were composed, focused, but their posture had changed. No one leaned back in casual disregard now. Every gaze that turned toward Eunice was tempered with care. No longer pity, no longer condescension, only respect and a dawning, cautious reverence. William entered and softened his voice as much as pride would allow. I want to apologize for how I treated you earlier. I didn't know who you were. Eunice looked up at him. Her gaze wasn't cold. It wasn't angry. It was still, deep, like a lake in winter that sees everything beneath its surface but chooses not to stir. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me decently, she said quietly. I'm a human being, not a secret. The room held its breath. William nodded faintly and stepped back to his seat, but inside, he knew the truth. His apology, however sincere, came far too late. The calls he had just made were only the first tremors in a chain of consequences that had already begun to unfurl beyond his control. And the woman he once dismissed, ignored, and insulted now held in her hands the stability, perhaps even the survival of the empire he once believed untouchable. The game was over. The joke he made this morning was no longer a joke. It was a red alert, and everything was beginning to unravel because of a quiet voice that dared to step into a room where truth had long been unwelcome. The air in the conference room had thickened to the point where it felt like breath itself had weight. No one wanted to be the first to speak. After William Prescott Jr. returned to his seat, silence settled in again, not expectant, but brittle, like a pane of glass straining under pressure. Eunice Mae Johnson remained seated in the same calm posture, her hands resting gently on the table, her gaze steady, unhurried, not cold, not indifferent, just still in a way that made people uneasy. It was the kind of stillness that came not from inexperience or timidity, but from living an entire life being underestimated, and now, at long last, holding the truth in both hands. It was Clara Simmons who finally broke the silence, turning slightly toward the bank's two legal representatives. Her voice was composed but decisive. I recommend that we formally recognize Mrs. Eunice Mae Johnson as a strategic shareholder with full rights across all assets under Johnson Holdings and its affiliated entities. Effective immediately, she will be included in any meeting or decision involving those investments, whether directly or indirectly. The two lawyers exchanged a glance. Then one of them spoke with measured clarity. We concur. The legal documents have been verified. Mrs. Johnson is the sole and direct heir under a valid notarized will. There are no grounds for dispute. William's eyes closed. His hand tightened on his thigh until his knuckles paled. Never in his long career had he imagined sitting on equal ground with someone like Eunice, not in title, not in power. And yet, here they were. Reality offered no alternate path but acceptance. Clara turned to Eunice with a tone of professional respect. Do you have any requests before we proceed? Eunice nodded slightly and opened her worn leather purse. She pulled out a folded sheet of paper, its creases showing signs of long handling. As she unfolded it and laid it gently on the table, heads leaned forward instinctively. It was a handwritten document, a ledger of sorts, Dorothy's internal record, written in her own careful script. Each line detailed instances of discriminatory behavior witnessed over nearly 3 decades within the institution. Dates, names, specific responses, nothing vague, nothing forgotten. By the 15th entry, several people in the room had lowered their eyes. Clara was silent, eyes locked on the page. She had known Dorothy was meticulous, but she had not imagined this level of detail, of quiet endurance, chronicled so precisely. Eunice looked up, her gaze now fixed squarely on William. I didn't come here to retaliate. I came to make sure what she endured didn't vanish into silence. She left this to me not to amass more wealth, but to leverage it for real change. William gave a short, bitter laugh, stripped of confidence. And what change is that, Mrs. Johnson? You want me removed from the board? Contracts canceled? You want the whole city to see me as a racist? Eunice responded without hesitation, her voice unshaken. I don't need to do anything, Mr. Prescott. You've done it all yourself. I'm only holding up the truth, one of the attorneys interjected, attempting to cool the room. Perhaps we should focus on solutions. Rather than escalate the situation, we might consider how to move forward in a mutually beneficial way. Clara nodded in agreement. I believe if Mr. Prescott issues a formal apology and proposes a concrete plan for workplace reform, including dialogue with community groups, we may be able to avoid both a media crisis and potential litigation. William sat in silence. For the first time, he no longer felt like the player at the center of the game. He was a pawn, backed into a corner. And the woman he had once laughed off as a passing inconvenience now held the entire board in her hands. Eunice looked slowly around the room, then spoke with a voice as firm and clear as a breeze moving through a weathered window frame. I don't want anyone to lose their job. I only want people like me when we walk into a place like this not to be looked at like we've stepped into the wrong world. The room paused, as if struck still. No one replied, but something in the air shifted. The confrontation was no longer about victory or defeat. It had become a mirror held up to an entire system, asking a question it had too long refused to answer. And in the center of that room sat one woman, not shouting, not demanding, just holding them all in the quiet weight of her presence, making it impossible to look away. Just when the room seemed to reach its most fragile silence, when the tension hung so thick no one dared to breathe too deeply, Marcus Franklin, the Johnson family's longtime attorney, finally spoke. His voice was low, deliberate, each word placed with the weight of a stone, not raised in volume, but enough to still the air entirely. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a thick folder, and laid it gently on the polished wood of the conference table. This, he said, is an independent investigative report documenting systemic discriminatory practices across this bank's high-tier branches, including, most notably, the Charleston location, where this morning's incident occurred. He paused, letting that settle before continuing. We've been gathering evidence for several months. Much of it was documented by Mrs. Dorothy Mae Johnson. The rest comes from recordings and visual documentation collected by my client, Mrs. Eunice Mae Johnson, during repeated instances of being denied service or treated with suspicion, despite meeting every financial threshold required for premium access. Each word from Marcus struck like a slow, measured blow. William Prescott's eyes fell on the folder as if it held a personal indictment carved in stone. He didn't move. He didn't blink. Clara Simmons glanced briefly toward Marcus, her lips tight, her silence betraying the strain behind her usual composure. She had once admired William, had even defended him, but she also knew the truth no one liked to say aloud. No system runs as cleanly as it claims, and this one, like so many others, had been running on a silence that Dorothy had documented line by line. Marcus turned toward the bank's legal team now. Contained in this file are no fewer than 13 documented cases in which clients with account balances well above the qualification threshold were denied access to premium services. Why? Because they did not fit the image certain employees expected. We have names, dates, audio, surveillance footage. Most of the employees involved operated under the direct oversight of Mr. Prescott. One of the attorneys swallowed hard. The other flipped hurriedly through the first few pages of the report, his face tightening with each line. Still, Eunice said nothing. She stared out the tall glass windows, where the sun had begun to dip behind Charleston's gleaming skyline. Her gaze seemed to travel far beyond the room, far beyond this day, reaching into a past where she once walked these marble floors quietly, head down, rag in hand, careful not to meet anyone's eyes. Marcus pressed forward. According to the shareholder agreement, Mrs. Johnson now holds the authority to request a full internal audit, to demand transparency in client service policies, and to call for review of all senior-level promotions where evidence of bias or ethical violations is present. Furthermore, we are preparing a civil suit should no concrete actions be taken within 30 days. William sprang to his feet, his voice tight and rising. This is retaliation, not justice. She just wants revenge. That's what this is all about. Eunice turned to him slowly. Her voice was soft, so soft it almost didn't feel like a response, but it stilled the room more completely than any shout could. "Mr. Prescott," she said, "if I wanted revenge, I would have done it in silence. I would have used our financial leverage to quietly pull funding, redirect deals, and cut your company off at the knees without ever stepping into this room. But I'm here, facing you, saying every word out loud so that you and everyone else understand. This isn't a power move, it's a lesson, not just for you, for the system you helped build." Clara leaned slightly toward William, her voice a whisper, but heavy with consequence. "We have no ground to stand on. If the press gets even a whiff of this, stock value will drop before sunset. We need to get in front of it, now." William pulled a handkerchief from his jacket pocket, wiped his brow, and sank back into his chair. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "I'll approve the formation of an independent internal review committee, with one member nominated by Mrs. Johnson's team. We'll also prepare a formal press statement reaffirming our commitment to equity and diversity. And I'll issue a public apology to the Johnson family." Eunice nodded once. "That's the first step. What follows, I will walk with. Not as a saint, not as your ideal symbol. I'll be the shadow you can't ignore, the memory that makes every person at this table pause before they approve, promote, dismiss, or look away." No one spoke after that. Only the slanting light of the late afternoon sun remained, casting its glow across the face of a black woman who had lived most of her life in silence, and who now, without raising her voice, was rewriting the first lines of a new chapter. Not for herself alone, but for every generation before her that had been erased. And while the elite walls of that institution scrambled to control the fallout, she calmly slid the folder back into her bag. The counterattack had been launched, but more than a legal maneuver, it was a reminder that justice, even if late, can still arrive so long as someone dares to walk back into the room where they were once denied and speak the truth out loud. Only hours after the executive meeting ended behind closed doors, the first press release from Charleston Capital's headquarters sent shockwaves across the country. Under the brief but potent headline, "Bank Reaffirms Commitment to Equity and Honors Community Legacy," financial news outlets and social media platforms lit up in a storm of commentary, analysis, and controversy. Yet it wasn't the statement itself that set everything spiraling out of control. It was a video, just under 4 minutes long, that spread like wildfire across every major platform. In that video, the soft, steady voice of Eunice Johnson echoed through the bank's gilded lobby, repeating the very words she had spoken to William Prescott, and a room full of dismissive glances. Her voice carried no anger, no trembling sorrow. It was plain-spoken, shaped by years of silence, years of waiting, but rooted in a dignity that had never faded. And then came the moment, Prescott lowering his head. For the first time in his storied financial career, he listened not to a board chair, not to a market report, but to the legal terms dictated by a black woman who once cleaned the floors of the institution he thought he controlled. The footage, pulled from internal security cameras at the request of attorney Marcus Franklin, became the center of a national reckoning. On evening commentary shows, from major networks to independent podcasts, the questions were no longer about just one incident. They were about power, about race, about the decades-long silence within elite financial institutions. They were about what happens when someone steps into a room they were never meant to enter and refuses to leave quietly. Within 24 hours, Charleston Capital stock dropped nearly 1/4 in value. Major stakeholders called emergency meetings. Several strategic partners froze ongoing negotiations. Brands that had once proudly co-branded with the bank scrambled to scrub their name from upcoming campaigns. Mid-level executives resigned, some quietly, others with public statements citing a moral imperative. Online, the bank's social channels became battlegrounds. People who had been turned away for not dressing appropriately, who spoke with regional accents, who didn't look the part of a premium client, they found their voices through Eunice Johnson. Testimonies flooded in, often tagged with her name, turning her into an unofficial symbol for long-denied justice. Stories once whispered in anger were now posted, shared, and seen. Even the city government could not remain silent. Charleston's mayor announced the creation of an independent advisory council for financial equity and extended a personal invitation to Mrs. Johnson to serve as honorary advisor. Back at her small home office, once filled only with faded photos and a ticking wall clock that no longer kept time, there were now stacks of handwritten letters, flowers, thank you cards from strangers. People who had known her only as a quiet cleaner stood stunned, trying to reconcile that image with the woman they now saw on screens, composed, unwavering, and unwilling to be forgotten. But Eunice remained unchanged. She still rose before the sun, still boiled water for her morning tea, still spent a few quiet moments in front of Dorothy's framed photograph. She wasn't waiting for praise. To her, the real victory wasn't the public apology, nor the headlines. It was the look in the eyes of young black men and women who now saw her and saw, in her, the possibility that this world could change. William Prescott Jr. had not made a public appearance since the meeting. Sources close to the board reported mounting pressure for his resignation, with an announcement expected in the coming weeks. The empire he once represented, a towering edifice of wealth, status, and unchallenged authority, now trembled under the weight of what he had dismissed too easily. An old woman, a forgotten name, and a truth that could no longer be ignored. In a single day, a reputation built over decades cracked beyond repair. And it wasn't rage that brought it down. It wasn't scandal. It was something far more enduring. A quiet strength, a steady voice, and the name Eunice Johnson. As the media storm slowly quieted and the noise of public outrage began to fade, Eunice Johnson did not retreat into the silence of an old life, as many might have expected. Instead, she began laying the first stones of a new world, not just for herself, but for the generations that had grown up and would continue to grow up in the forgotten corners of society. She had no desire to be a symbol to be paraded or the center of anyone's pity. All she wanted was to fulfill one final promise made to her late sister. In her modest home, where the walls still bore the scent of years shaped by labor and quiet endurance, Eunice began opening each envelope, reading every letter of thanks and gently taking notes in her worn leather journal. She sorted them carefully, the students in need of scholarships, the single mothers struggling to navigate financial systems that never saw them, the working men denied loans for the way they spoke or the zip code they came from. 1 month after the reckoning at Charleston Capital, she quietly launched an organization called Dorothy's Table. The name was simple, humble, but deeply symbolic. It was not a glossy foundation with towering ambitions or a sleek new venture shouting for attention. It was what it sounded like: a table, a wooden one, a bit uneven at the legs, where people could come and sit, be heard, receive guidance, access support without shame or fear. And people came. Volunteers appeared from everywhere. Some were lawyers who had once walked away from the profession, weary of the games and the compromise. Others were former bankers who had grown tired of averting their gaze. And then there were students, young, wide-eyed, eager, many of whom felt for the first time that they were part of something truly meaningful. Eunice took no seat on any board. She refused honorary titles. She asked only to be called Miss Eunice, just as they had called her for 40 years while she walked the polished hallways of buildings she once cleaned. But even without official titles, her influence rippled outward. Smaller banks in the region reached out to partner with Dorothy's Table, hoping to rethink their customer service policies, especially for minority communities. Universities invited her to speak on ethics and legacy. The media requested interviews, publishers offered book deals, filmmakers asked for life rights. Eunice declined most of them. She said simply that if anyone truly wanted to know who she was, they could come to the office, walk to the small room at the end of the hallway, and sit at the table. There, they could listen to the stories of ordinary people trying to live decent lives in a world that wasn't always decent to them. On one occasion, the mayor of Charleston hosted a ceremony in her honor at City Hall. When Eunice walked onto the stage, she didn't wear new gown or polished pearls. She wore the soft gray blouse that once belonged to Dorothy, and a small wooden brooch shaped like a spoon, a reminder that real power doesn't reside in titles, but in the quiet, consistent work of hands that have served. As the audience rose in thunderous applause, she spoke only one sentence. "I am not a hero," she said. "I'm just an old woman who refused to let someone else decide what I was worth. And then she bowed her head. That was enough. The new world Eunice Johnson was building did not rise from anger or revenge. It was born of endurance, of memory, of all the small, invisible things that live longer than slogans and outlast headlines. And in that quiet, in that unshakable grace, she became not a symbol, but a steady place to rest for thousands of others still searching for hope. Even though she never sought the spotlight, the name Eunice Johnson continued to echo through the boardrooms of Charleston Capital rooms that had once dismissed her with nothing more than a glance. But what shook the city to its core was not her title, nor the quiet strength of the organization she founded. It was the unexpected appearance of a man many believed would remain forever silent. Richard Harrington, chief executive officer of Charleston Capital, a man who had been notably absent throughout the entire media storm, stepped forward not on a stage or in front of cameras, but during a memorial service held at St. Andrew's Church, the very church where Dorothy had volunteered as a cleaner for 30 years. Gone was the tailored suit. In its place, a plain gray coat. He walked slowly to the wooden pulpit at the front of the sanctuary, his eyes tight with strain, but resolute. As the murmuring crowd quieted, his gaze settled on the front pew, where Eunice sat surrounded by scholarship students and volunteers, her presence as grounded as ever. Then he began to speak. His voice was hoarse, halting, as though the words had waited decades to come out. He spoke of a day more than 30 years ago when he was a young associate, just beginning his career. That morning, he had witnessed Dorothy Johnson being denied the right to open a bank account for no real reason. She had worn an old knit sweater, canvas slippers, and held a stack of neatly folded documents inside a plastic bag. He remembered her eyes, steady but heavy, the kind of eyes that no longer expected fairness. And then he confessed. He had said nothing. He said nothing because he was afraid of losing his job, afraid that speaking up wouldn't matter. But now, after so many years, he finally understood that silence itself had weight. That silence, too, was a form of participation. The sanctuary was so still, it felt like the whole city was holding its breath. Eunice didn't nod. She didn't cry. She simply looked at him direct, composed as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. Richard went on. His voice steadied. He spoke of how Dorothy, even after being denied that day, had returned to the bank year after year, quietly cleaning desks and polishing floors without complaint. He never once saw bitterness in her. And yet it wasn't until he read the letter she left behind for Eunice that he understood the depth of her strength. In that letter, Dorothy had written, "I do not want revenge. I only hope that one day those who turned away will find the courage to turn around." Richard paused. Then, quietly, he said, "Today, I'm here to turn around." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't wrap it in excuses. He simply admitted the truth, the failure, and the moral debt he knew he would never repay. For a moment, time held still. Then, from the back of the church, a single pair of hands began to clap soft, unhurried, sincere. An older man, salt-haired, a retired schoolteacher, then a second, a third. And finally, the entire congregation rose to its feet. Not in applause for Richard, but in acknowledgement of something rare, someone choosing to face the past rather than bury it. Eunice remained seated, but for the first time since this story began, she smiled a quiet, knowing smile. It wasn't for triumph. It was for healing. No one expected such a moment to come from the man at the top of the very institution that once shut its doors to women like Dorothy. But no one could deny what that moment had become, a closing of a chapter with the dignity it had always deserved. It was not a gesture that erased the past, but it was the kind of truth that honors it. And in the stillness that followed, beneath the stained glass of St. Andrew's, one could almost feel Dorothy's presence, soft as a whisper, steady as a hand on the shoulder, knowing that at last the seeds she had planted had taken root. That afternoon, as the ceremony drew to a close, the crowd quietly filed out of St. Andrew's Church, leaving behind more reflection than words. But not everyone left right away. At the back of the church grounds, tucked beneath the sweeping branches of a deep red maple turning with the season, Richard Harrington sat alone on a weathered bench. There were no cameras now, no reporters waiting, only a man who had once stood at the pinnacle of Charleston Capital, now face to face with the quiet reckoning of his own past. Eunice Johnson stepped out slowly. Her soft-soled shoes barely made a sound against the stone path. She didn't look at him as an adversary. She looked at him like someone who had always known this moment would come. Richard lifted his head, his eyes worn but honest. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "I didn't come for you," she answered, her voice as calm and even as the wind moving gently through the leaves. "I came for my grandmother, for people like her who spent their lives lowering their heads so they wouldn't be seen as a threat." Richard nodded. "I used to think silence was wisdom. Now I see it was just cowardice dressed up in good manners." Eunice didn't correct him. She only sat beside him, leaving just enough space for honesty to settle between them. "You know," she said, "people often think the greatest lesson is what happens when your name falls from grace. But the real lesson is when a man realizes he gave up the chance to be decent long ago, simply because he didn't see the worth in another human being." Richard said nothing, and for the first time, he didn't try to explain himself. He didn't defend, didn't deflect. He only asked one question, quiet and stripped of ego. "Then what do I do now to make it right?" Eunice turned to him, not with softness, but with clarity. "You don't make it right, but you can begin again, not for me, for the people you'll meet next. You can learn to listen, not to respond, but to understand. You can use whatever power you still hold to lift up the ones who were pushed down like my grandmother. That's the only way to make sure what was lost doesn't stay meaningless." Richard let out a long breath. "I'm not sure I have enough time left to fix it." Eunice looked out into the horizon. "My grandmother used to say, 'No one can go back and start over, but anyone can start from where they are and shape a different ending. What you choose now, that's yours to live with.'" They sat there, beneath the quiet sky of a windless late afternoon, like two mismatched pieces of a life's portrait finally pressed into place. There were no tears, no embraces, but something real had shifted. A change, subtle yet unshakable, had begun to take root. And perhaps in that moment, that was the final lesson for the man who once dismissed her entirely. That forgiveness is not about erasing the harm. It's about reminding the forgiven that they must now live a life worthy of the second chance they've been given. The story of Eunice Johnson did not end within the towering walls of glass or the thunderous press conferences. Instead, it began to ripple outward like a gentle yet unrelenting wave, moving far beyond the boundaries of scandal or legal discourse. It became the kind of story quietly passed along in classrooms where social justice is taught, and it found its way into inspiring talks for young black girls still searching for their own voices. 1 month after that fateful day, the headquarters of Charleston Capital unveiled a new bronze plaque at its front entrance bearing the words, "Eunice Johnson Center for Entrepreneurial Support," honoring not just one woman, but an entire generation of women who had once been forgotten. The local school district also included her name in their community history honors program. But for Eunice, titles had never been the thing she sought. In her small home at the end of Magnolia Street, she still rose early as always, brewed her ginger tea, and watered her plants. Only now, the neighborhood children no longer called her just Miss Eunice, the retired lady. They called her the greatest storyteller they had ever met. The children would often gather quietly on her front porch during late weekend afternoons to listen. She would tell them about winter mornings in Georgia, when she and her mother would rise in the dim blue light before dawn to head out for cleaning work. She would recount the promise her mother made before she passed, that if Eunice ever found her voice, she should not use it to shout, but to whisper to those who had never been heard. A little girl once asked her if she'd been afraid standing before all those powerful people. Eunice had smiled, her eyes gleaming like water reflecting the last light of day. "Of course," she said, "but my grandmother taught me that courage is not the absence of fear. It is knowing fear and still walking forward." On another day, a young boy asked how someone could know if they were strong enough to face injustice. Eunice had paused, then said softly, "You don't have to be strong from the start. You only have to never stop believing you deserve to be treated with respect." Her words were more than memories. They were a living legacy, flowing through generations, across skin colors and beyond social class. They became part of a collective memory, a reminder that sometimes the people considered the smallest hold the strength to shake an entire system. Richard Harrington, once a symbol of financial power and polished ambition, had since become a quiet benefactor of community education programs. He no longer appeared before cameras, but his name began to show up among the donors to local libraries, to scholarship funds for black students, and most notably, in support of the publication of Eunice's memoir. That book, titled When I Check the Balance, was more than just a life story. It was a wake-up call to anyone who had forgotten that dignity should never be measured by the numbers in one's bank account. And when a young reporter asked her why she chose that title, Eunice had simply smiled. "Because, my dear, people thought I was going to the bank to check my money. But really, I was checking how far this society had come in its respect for people like me. And I think I got my answer." That answer no longer belonged to her alone. It had become a story passed from one person to another, like a small light that never goes out, a story meant to be carried on. There are victories that arrive not with the thunder of applause or framed certificates proudly displayed on the wall, but quietly, like dew resting gently after a long rain. No one claps, yet everyone can taste the sweetness of something reborn. For Eunice Johnson, her victory was never about defeating anyone, and certainly not about revenge. It was a journey to reclaim the place she and those like her should have stood in from the very beginning. One early winter morning, when the sunlight was still timidly streaming through the small window pane, Eunice was making tea when the doorbell rang. She opened the door to find a young woman about 20 years old, wearing a worn denim jacket and holding a crumpled notebook in her hand. Her name was Althea, her own granddaughter and a senior journalism student at a local community college. She said she had read Eunice's memoir 3 times, and each time she discovered something not in the words but in the silences between the lines. She asked if Eunice would be willing to share more, not for a major newspaper or television network, but for her campus paper, where stories like Eunice's were still rare treasures. Eunice nodded, not because she longed to speak more, but because she understood that when you are given the chance to speak, the next responsibility is to clear a path for others. A week later, Althea's interview appeared on the front page. The headline was simple: "The woman who once wiped tables at the bank now teaches me how to stand tall." Not many people read the article on the first day, but it was photographed, shared, passed around in classroom discussions and small group meetings among high school students in distant towns. A teacher in another state printed it out and read it aloud during an ethics class. A single mother taped it to the refrigerator as a reminder to her daughter that you don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You only need to speak at the right time, in the right way, and with all the dignity you carry. Eunice never knew all of that, and she didn't need to. She continued her quiet life among the garden beds and the late afternoon porch stories told to children. But every so often, walking past the corner grocery store, she would hear someone say her name with a smile. Not because she was famous, but because she had done the right thing at a time when no one else dared to. That was a victory that required no applause. Once, she received a handwritten letter from someone who chose not to sign their name. The handwriting was uneven, perhaps belonging to an older person. They wrote that once, years ago, they had laughed when they saw her walk into that bank. Now, they had no fortune left to redeem their mistake, only a few honest words, hoping she would understand that some bows of the head, even when late, are still better than none at all. Eunice folded the letter and placed it into an old wooden box where she kept her most treasured mementos. Inside were a photograph of her grandmother, a slip of paper from the first scholarship she had ever received, and now this anonymous letter. To her, it was the clearest proof that even when no one stands to cheer, some hearts have quietly changed. And as she once told the children, a true victory is not when the crowd applauds, but when you know you did not stay silent in a moment that called for a voice. The real triumph is when you can look at yourself in the mirror and not have to lower your eyes. One quiet afternoon, as the golden hue of dusk stretched softly like a silken veil across the rooftops in a small garden bathed in fading light, Eunice Johnson stood before an old mirror tucked into the corner of her living room. She gazed deeply into the reflection of her eyes, eyes that had borne witness to both the bitterness and the beauty of a life fully lived. Every wrinkle, every line etched across her face stood as quiet testimony to a journey that had been anything but easy, yet was marked by resilience and love. On a nearby wooden shelf, her memoir rested silently beside a black and white photograph of her late grandmother. Eunice gently touched the frame, smiled, and whispered, "Dorothy, I did it. Today they speak your name not for the work you did as a maid, but for the legacy you left behind, for the lessons you passed on in your quiet way. It was the lesson that dignity does not come from a job title, or the clothes one wears, or the seat one holds at a table. It comes from kindness, and from a self-respect that never allows itself to be lost." That evening, inside a modest auditorium at the local high school, Eunice stood before hundreds of students, parents, and teachers. As a soft light spilled across the worn wooden stage, she told her story not for pity and not to be praised, but so the young people in front of her might understand that sometimes the greatest things begin from something very small. A voice rose from the back row. "Miss Eunice, when people laughed at you in that bank, what kept you from walking away?" She paused for a breath, then looked directly at the questioner and answered with the quiet truth that lived in her bones. "Because in that moment, I heard my sister's voice in my head. She told me that there comes a time when someone must be the one to step forward, and I knew, if I didn't, no one else would. So I stepped forward." The room fell into a hush, not because of any grand declaration, but because of a sincerity that could not be denied. That was the power of someone ordinary, who held an unshakable belief in doing what was right. Eunice's story stands as a reminder to us all that life may always have injustice, but we don't have to be heroes to be the cause of change. Sometimes all it takes is one person with the courage to speak, one person willing to rise at the right moment to set into motion a wave that can alter the course of a generation. And if you're watching this video, perhaps that story has found its way into a quiet corner of your heart. How did it make you feel to hear the journey of that woman? Have you ever witnessed or endured injustice in your own life? We invite you to share your thoughts below, because your voice, too, is a vital part of this loving community. Don't forget to subscribe to the Emotional Echoes channel, hit like, and share this video if you believe it deserves to be seen by others. Every day we bring stories that reach the heart so that together we can pause, reflect, and grow from the simple yet deeply meaningful truths of life. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish you good health, lasting happiness, renewed energy, and peace in your soul. We'll see you again in the next video on Emotional Echoes. Until then, goodbye, and may all good things find their way to you and those you love.